Earthquake damage is a bit like throwing a hand grenade into a crowded room. You could kill everyone or no one or some of the people in between.
Christchurch earthquake showed us that how important the interaction between soil and structure is.
If you want to understand the behavior of a building during an earthquake, you have to understand the behavior of the whole system.
On the 22nd of February 2011, a major earthquake struck Christchurch, New Zealand. On that day, 185 people died. 115 of them died in a building just over there, the CTV building. Why in this modern age do so many people still die in earthquakes? In 1996, when I made a documentary, I predicted a lot of what happened to the city of Christchurch. After the quake, I was asked by a reporter, why didn't I do more to get council to prepare for this quake? I said at the time, maybe I should have camped outside the Mayor's office. Well, this documentary is me camping outside the Mayor's office. There are still outstanding issues that need to be addressed. Issues that, if not taken care of, will cause many more people to die.
Christchurch, Wellington.
This story began 20 years ago when my documentary Earthquake went to air.
Christchurch. The worst that's happened so far has been the toppling of the cathedral's spire. Few locals expect serious problems. But Christchurch does have a fatal flaw. It sits on a soft, shaky sponge of river stones and silt half a kilometre deep. In any decent quake, the garden city will shake like a leaf.
Back then, many thought this documentary was just sensationalism. February 2011 changed all that. This documentary isn't about the severe liquefaction that struck Christchurch. That story's been well told. And it's not about civil defence or community resilience. Many heartwarming stories have already been told there too. This documentary is about tall buildings, those that kill and killed people in Christchurch, what went wrong and what's been done about it. So this is where my story began. In 1996, a scientist told me that a building that once stood behind me, that's the Christchurch Women's Nurses Home, could, in certain circumstances, shake up to 20 times more than a building somewhere else in Christchurch. And the height of the building was also critical. This building was 6 stories high. So now I'm on a quest to find out if it's true. Did the CTV and PGC buildings resonate and shake themselves apart? These 2 buildings alone accounted for 3/4 of Christchurch's near 200 deaths. This documentary will dig beneath the surface and will look for other reasons besides poor design that may have been at play here. But first, why did only 2 relatively modern buildings collapse when scores of older buildings didn't?
In general, buildings perform pretty well when you take into consideration that the February earthquake especially was very much up to full design standard.
The old style unreinforced masonry buildings were expected to perform badly. Many of them had been brought down on the 4th of September and fortunately there was no total collapse.
A lot of the brick walls fell down and unfortunately injured and in some cases killed people.
Surprisingly, some very good performing buildings were reinforced concrete from the 1950s. A lot of reinforced concrete buildings from the 70s and 80s should have performed better. A lot of more modern buildings constructed in the 1980s had a lot of damage on them and had to be demolished. I think it's been said by engineers associated with one tall building there that a few more cycles it would have come down.
I'm still curious to know why buildings collapsed when 1940s buildings didn't.
Well, which buildings you're referring to?
The CTV building.
Those are exceptions.
The CTV building was a building that was poorly designed. There were a number of design faults.
The failures were probably in the joints, and once they failed, then the building had no ability to carry its load anymore.
You just made a comment that the buildings that got in trouble in Christchurch were 5 and 6 stories.
Well, CTV was a 6-storey building.
And PGC?
PGC was again about 5, 6 stories. PGC doesn't surprise me because it was designed in the 1960s.
Surely the soils could be a significant factor in the failure of those 2 buildings.
Quite likely, quite likely.
So if one of New Zealand's most eminent professors agrees that soils could have been a major factor, what forces could be at play here? The benchmark for soils affecting tall buildings during a major earthquake dates back to 1985, when a huge magnitude 8 quake struck some 400 kilometres off the Mexican coast. It had a remarkable effect on a range of high-rise buildings far inland in Mexico City.
You have clay deposits immediately under Mexico City, at some parts of Mexico City, and so those clay deposits exhibited quite a pronounced site effect.
And the period of vibration of those soft clays were kind of coincident with the period of the ground motion, so it was amplified.
And buildings that had similar natural periods suffered very badly in that earthquake.
The period is the time that it takes for the building to oscillate from its central position across to the left, back to the right, and then back to the centre again.
And then what had come through was amplified by that soft basin.
So there was a double resonance effect through the soil deposit and then through the building itself, resulting in very significant responses and huge damage.
That aspect of soil response was known about in New Zealand, and a report written in 1991 did pick that up for Christchurch, but it wasn't absorbed into the loading standards or whatever in the intervening period.
So what type of earthquake could cause such an effect in Christchurch? Well, a large distant quake on any number of surrounding faults could do it. And then there's the matter of the Alpine Fault, over 100 kilometres in that direction. How will that affect Christchurch's tall buildings?
Well, the Alpine Fault is obviously the biggest fault in the South Island.
The Alpine Fault event will be truly an earthquake which will cause large ground shaking to the entire South Island region.
The characteristic time is roughly about 300 years, something like that. And the last time it went was, roughly 300 years ago. It could be, this is our thinking, a very smooth surface. So if one bit goes, everything goes.
Earthquake power is measured in Gs, the force of gravity at sea level. A few percent is light, 200% is extreme. So how much will downtown Christchurch shake?
Preliminary modelling of an Alpine Fault earthquake, magnitude 8.2 earthquake, estimated ground shaking in Christchurch is relatively small, in a few percent G, compared to what has been experienced in Christchurch, with level up to 200% G.
So, Christchurch gets away from the Alpine Fault quake almost scot-free. Wow. However, the Alpine Fault still holds a significant threat because of the effects of long-distance shaking at low frequencies.
The size of the earthquake really will generate very long period shaking in Christchurch. And not only long period in terms of the frequency of the shaking going up and down, but also in terms of duration.
And the number of significant cycles, those are cycles that are damaging for engineering structures, is going to be 15, 20 or maybe 30.
If you start shaking a structure at a moderate level, but for 3 minutes, what's going to be the new fragility of that structure?
Generally, tall buildings will be more susceptible to large magnitude earthquakes.
And since you have many cycles, then you are getting into this resonance effect and cumulative damage effects.
But that's not the whole story. The Alpine Fault danger area could be a lot larger than previously thought.
There is good evidence that what happens with the Alpine Fault is that actually, as you go deeper, rather than it just staying as a vertical crack, it actually flattens out. And so it underlies a large section of central South Island, all the way from Queenstown up to Mount Cook. So that would actually mean that it would be a much bigger earthquake than people think.
And there's another sobering fact. 3/4 of the gaps between previous Alpine quakes have been shorter than the current gap. And while we're at it, I should mention a particularly nasty quake that's coming one day.
is the biggest hidden fault of all on the eastern side of New Zealand, which is the subduction zone. So if you drilled a hole vertically beneath Wellington, well, you go down 25 kilometres, you'd hit this fault. Now that fault could be a really big earthquake, and we can't see that at all.
They actually also unlock in a very smooth and slow fashion.
Now you might think that that might reduce the hazard, because in a sense it's easier for the two plates to slide past each other.
And sometimes they get stuck.
But it actually makes the hazard even greater, because what it means is that if only one tiny bit of that system breaks, then the whole thing goes.
We don't really know when the last one was.
That's correct, because it's so deep.
If they don't come to the surface, it's very, very difficult to know when they last went.
They have found evidence of 2 large tsunamis that occurred in the last 1,000 years.
And this could even be a size 9 quake.
Yes, we cannot rule out the possibility of a very large megathrust earthquake.
But hold on, magnitude 8 and 9 quakes. Christchurch's most destructive quake was way smaller. What's going on here?
Generally, we talk about an earthquake as defined by magnitude, which is how much energy is released from the earthquake source. So in that regard, definitely the 22nd of February earthquake is small. The actual square kilometre area that it caused really strong ground shaking in was quite limited. That if, for example, at the time of that earthquake you were located in Christchurch Airport to the northwest of Christchurch, the ground shaking there was actually quite small. If you compare the magnitude 6.2 earthquake in February 2011 with a magnitude 7.8 earthquake which occurred in 2009 in Fiordland, that one is releasing about 10,000 times as much energy as the other.
Okay, so Christchurch's quake was tiddly. So why so much damage? Well, there's a smorgasbord of theories as to why things got so intense.
One particular mechanism is the trampoline effect. So you have a very soft layer on top of a not so soft layer. And so by inputting very large vertical accelerations, that top soft layer, by the time it comes back, it's a slap down effect or trampoline effect.
The basin effects, which really, that jargon really relates to the deep sedimentary basin under a particular location. It's a three-dimensional effect, and so it's affected by the direction that the earthquake's coming from.
A popcorn effect, which is again by inputting very large accelerations vertically into a column or a layer of very soft soils. Then every layer is going to expand, and by expanding one after the other, you're getting like a popcorn effect.
Okay, so soils seem to be at the base of all this, and Christchurch's soils seem to amplify shaking.
Some areas have very much amplified motion, which is obviously a function of the natural periods of the ground in those locations.
Do you know of actual buildings that were amplified?
Not specifically. I suspect that some of them actually showed up those effects quite markedly.
Because of the Avon River and the different meanders of the river branches, the side-to-side variability was enormous. So you could sit in one site and feel the earthquake in a particular fashion, and you move 200 meters and the impact would be very different.
We know that some buildings got hammered, and if they were near the rivers, they probably had, again, very soft foundations.
Hammered, rivers, soft foundations. Some words are repeating themselves. Could there be a word that pulls all this together? Could that word be resonance? Most of you will know what resonance is, but just in case you don't, here's a 101 primer.
So if I just shake this glass of water, for instance, very quickly, you can see the water isn't really moving very much. But if I slow it down, so a lower frequency at some point, the water is moving a whole lot, and this is the resonant frequency of the glass. And if I slow down even more, you get nothing.
If you have a building with a 1 second period, the motion's at half a second or 3 seconds. The building says, well, I don't really notice those very much. But anything that's coming through near its own natural frequency will be amplified.
High frequency waves can also cause resonance. Is that true or not?
Yeah, no, it's true. I think all scientists would probably agree that you can get resonance at different frequencies, and it really just depends on your on the dimensions of your structure or basin or so on. So in Christchurch, what we've got is waves coming in the deep basin, resonating in at quite a low frequency. And then you get towards the surface and there's another softer layer, and these are deposited by essentially the river coming down and the former flood channel. So these recent deposits are quite loose, quite soft, and will resonate quite strongly. But because they're not as thick, they will actually resonate at a higher frequency.
High frequency amplification. Not many seem to know about this. And of course, high frequency resonance will cause problems for shorter high rises. And this phenomenon isn't unusual. It's also been recorded near Wellington. The Parkway is one example of closer quakes causing more of a resonance.
Particular sites will respond predominantly to very high frequency shaking, which is usually dominated by local earthquakes.
Local earthquakes, that sounds familiar. Weren't the Christchurch quakes local? Could there be more from where they came from?
If you get a break in young gravels or sort of relatively unconsolidated rocks, then the nature very quickly covers up her tracks.
So who knows how many hidden faults are out there?
The biggest problem with the New Zealand hazard model is that a lot of the focus has been on faults that we know. Imagine that you're facing somebody with a gun. All your thinking is on that. And then you look behind you and you find 10 other people pointing guns at you that you hadn't even noticed.
But they say their models have a factor for the unknown faults.
But you can't have a factor for unknown faults, really. Well, you can, but in a sense you're sort of making it up, or it's what we would call a fudge factor.
But there's one fault close by they now have a pretty good idea about.
The Darfield earthquake, that's the first Christchurch earthquake in September 2010. But the maximum displacement was round about 5 metres. But as you moved along the ground break, that displacement became smaller and smaller. Eventually, once you got to the outskirts of Christchurch, it disappeared altogether. 6 months later, there was another earthquake. And then when they compared the second earthquake to the first earthquake, they realised that they didn't link up. Given the size of both earthquakes, we would expect there to be a third earthquake in this gap region that will essentially link all the breaks.
So there are plenty of not so good reasons to be wary of both the low frequencies of distant quakes and the high frequencies of close by quakes.
But what engineers are well aware of and what they have to take into account is that a building will also have its own resonant frequency. And if that resonant frequency matches the resonant frequency of the ground under certain earthquake conditions, where you've got a lot of energy coming in at that particular frequency, then you've got amplification on top of that. So say you have 2 times or 3 times the energy at that frequency.
Okay, I think you've got it by now. So I then went off to talk with the officials. First, the government's own chief engineer. You can't get much higher than that. And then I met with a representative of both the New Zealand Society of Earthquake Engineering, that's NSEE, and the Institution of Professional Engineers of New Zealand, IPENZ. What about what some people call double resonance, where the building and the soil shake at the same period?
Yeah, well I think that's where that warning comes from in the commentary to 1170.5. It's really a phenomenon that was experienced in Mexico City.
But it is possible that in particular geological circumstances there might be some enhanced shaking that would come. Now that comes back to the question of an experienced engineer recognising that.
It's not something that would be typical in New Zealand.
There's still high-rise buildings in Christchurch.
There are, but we're talking about much higher rise than Christchurch are talking about.
I was talking to a scientist yesterday and she was of the opinion that there were cases of resonance in Christchurch where the soil resonated.
Yeah, but really to get to be of real danger. I mean, you just got to look at the performance of buildings in Christchurch. In the main, they performed okay.
But what about double resonance? Is that considered?
If you had a great deal of evidence that you were sitting on a bowl of jelly with a particular natural period which always vibrated whatever the earthquake with that natural period, you would be incompetent if you didn't take that into account.
to get real resonance effects, it needs a really big earthquake at a distant source so that you can get the whole earthquake, the whole motion really resonate.
She also pointed out that in some cases it could actually be a close earthquake that causes a resonance, not just a distance one.
Well, resonance is part of the whole way we design buildings.
That's just something we have to accept?
No, because you said, and perhaps collapses, in all but the very extreme earthquakes of very low probability, we would hope that that building would hang together enough so that, although it might be severely damaged, it wouldn't cause a lot of loss of life.
The seismologists tell us that there's a multiplying factor of shaking. When the basin effect happens, and if that happens to coincide with the period of the building, it may not have any option but to collapse. It may be that severe.
That's why you have earthquake engineers. The seismologists can tell you that information. Our challenge is to make sure the building doesn't shake itself to bits.
So you're confident that the engineers have got this covered?
I think we've got most of it covered. What we haven't got covered is the unknown, and we're always discovering some more unknowns.
But what is this most of it covered that he refers to? And how often worked out is the period or frequency at which a building's foundation will shake? To find out more, I visited a scientist with a dual speciality. He's a geotechnical engineer who deals with soils, plus a civil engineer who deals with buildings.
Every location, depending on the soil profile, will have its own specific sort of fundamental period.
This is regularly computed, isn't it?
No.
So you're saying that the period of the soil on which a building is designed for is not often worked out?
Yes, no, it would not. We wouldn't often, at a certain building location, know what the site period in a geotechnical sense would be.
Isn't that a concern?
The way that the design spectra is defined, effectively it's more of a conservative representation of what the design would be to try and envelope those sort of different
So that's caught by the envelope of the Class E or Class D. Without getting into too much detail, engineers have a set of seismic hazard graphs to refer to so that they can factor in soil quality for different regions. A is great, B and C are okay, but D and E are trouble.
In 1964, I designed Manchester Unity Building, or now SBS Towers. We knew that we had nothing solid till we got down to about 18 metres. And in fact, in 1965, they started pile driving, and one of the piles went down 7 metres on the first blow. So you have an idea how soft that material was.
It was mighty impressive.
Of critical importance are the graph's peaks. These show extremely dangerous soil amplification. In the Christchurch quake, there were peaks for I think about 1 second and then up about 3 seconds, which were outside of the envelopes. Does it catch them?
I guess you've got to look at that.
Should all of Christchurch's soils be E?
Probably not all, I think.
The basin effects, the huge G-forces and so forth. Are these being accounted for now in new designs?
There is a move, I guess, to start to look at things in terms of more of a site-specific sense.
If there are soft soil deposits in an area, a special study should be done if you're going to do a tall building.
Which brings us to microzoning. Microzoning is well advanced overseas, and while some research is carried out here, there doesn't seem to be much interest in applying findings. The old silo problem.
We are aware that soft foundations are a problem, and there's been a lot of work on microzoning in the Hutt Valley, in parts of Canterbury, etc., and parts of Auckland.
Is there a case for microzoning of Christchurch?
I'm not too sure how reliable it's going to be, because it's so variable. You might end up with microzoning that's less a block in size.
is it possible today to actually know what a block of land will do, a footprint of a building?
We're getting closer and closer to that goal. In fact, that's a major aspect that the seismological community and the engineering community are focusing on.
Microzoning might be a bit more of a problem in trying to get reliable data without spending millions.
But I mean, what's the point of designing the building to a certain strength if the soil beneath it could change everything?
It's like everything. We design for an earthquake. We don't know what earthquake we're designing for. The earthquakes we've had we'll never see again.
But we do know the soil.
We know the soil to a certain extent, but it also changes with time. There are buildings in parts of Iceland, in parts of the UK, and parts of Norway where the natural frequency changes with the seasons.
What I think I'm hearing is that buildings are still being built without really knowing the period of the soils on which they're standing.
Again, I haven't been too involved in what's going on in terms of the design.
But microzoning might actually save lots of lives.
It might, but I think the skill in microzoning is still, and the tools are not really fully there yet.
Okay, so it's not a simple story, and it looks like it's in the too hard basket. But guidelines have been produced, and they do advise advanced soil investigation techniques when in doubt about issues such as basin effects and resonance. Our paper basically said that you have to use two-dimensional or three-dimensional analysis to actually know whether the soil is going to resonate or not anyway. And again, I've been told that it's sort of done.
Well, where and in which situation, it depends, doesn't it?
3D is available, but it is computationally expensive. It is very difficult to perform it. It would take weeks or a month.
For Christchurch, I haven't seen any studies that can predict with any degree of accuracy in a micro sense what you should do for a particular site.
So it's the Rolls-Royce checkout as the 3D?
It is, so that would be used really for critical structures.
It's a very complex situation to come up with a definitive statement to say that this spot here is a dangerous one.
What's the answer then?
Well, the answer is to build a well-conditioned building which has the resilience to ride out just about anything thrown at it.
I got the impression that advanced soil studies are seldom done, and pursuing this line wasn't going to go anywhere. But I had another question, this time regarding a New Zealand Geotechnical Society publication. It required a change of hats. This is in liquefaction guidelines now, saying that New Zealand Standard 1170.5 2004 doesn't consider resonating soils. Only the more sophisticated 2D, 3D methods account for these, requiring specialists. So the standard doesn't cover it, does it? It doesn't require it.
Well, those are guidelines for liquefaction. Were developed 5-6 years ago for the first time, and the idea of those guidelines was to unify the practice.
The whole of Christchurch, because of its soil structure, should be considered for resonance, shouldn't it?
Not really. Actually, we
tall buildings.
We don't have those kind of tall buildings. I mean, the codes you're referring to, in Japan you have 50-story, 70-story buildings. The resonance effect that developed, for example, in Osaka during the Tohoku earthquake, 700 kilometers away, was a 50-story building. I mean, those are the types of structures and resonance effects, and if you have 20-story or something like that. So
in Mexico it was 10 to 15 stories.
10 to 20 stories, yeah. So, but then the soft clay deposit is quite significant, so that double resonance effect was for that reason. So I would say we have to be careful about those, but we have to recognize that actually that is not a huge problem in New Zealand.
Not a huge problem in New Zealand? Well, I guess for 50-story buildings, that is, which we don't have. But what about those 10 to 15-story buildings, or even 5 to 6-story buildings? A lot of the local recorders showed a strong peak, about 1 second, 1.3, depending which recorder we're talking about. And that must have correlated with some of the heights of some of the buildings in Christchurch.
Yes, so the key there is that And I mentioned it before, because it is a magnitude 6 event, it has very few cycles.
Do you think any buildings in Christchurch suffered from resonance?
You mean in terms of just the building
shaking at the same frequency as the soil?
I mean, throughout the earthquake, you have different frequencies that are occurring. In those earthquakes, there was, especially I guess the most damaging, the Christchurch earthquake, there wasn't many cycles of that earthquake.
So in that sense, there is not significant time to develop any resonance effector or response.
You don't have enough cycles to actually probably encourage that resonance to occur.
So have I reached a dead end? I've established that Christchurch still has plenty of earthquake threats and very dodgy soils. I've discovered that it's not just tall buildings that can resonate, but shorter 5 or 6 story buildings too. But has my case now been broadsided by the not enough time to build up resonance argument? But then I came across a PhD study by a promising new engineer.
If you don't modify the current thinking, solid structure interaction might be a problem for your design. Solid structure interaction was always considered to be beneficial. That kind of thinking was very simplified thinking, and it belongs to maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And our analysis was dealing with let's say, more appropriate solid structure interaction modeling, showed that in some scenarios, solid structure interaction might not be conservative. It might not be beneficial to a building. If the period of the ground motion is going to be pretty much similar to the period of the building, then you're going to have some resonant effect, which means that the forces which is transferred to your structure are going to be higher.
Masoud holds that a correct analysis of soil and structure interaction effects will produce a new force that may have detrimental effects on a building.
Current thinking is that new force is going to be less than the force that you use when you assume that the building is fixed at the base. But is it true? No. Recent earthquake shows that this is not true. You might have some bigger forces goes to your building, but that bigger force has not been calculated, has not been formulated in the current code, and that's why we are claiming that the current code is unconservative in some specific scenarios. If you don't modify the current thinking, solid structure interaction might be a problem for your design.
Until we get this under our belt, so to speak, the structural design of buildings could be somewhat compromised, couldn't it, in certain earthquakes?
In certain earthquakes, yes, that's right.
So it's actually, an urgent need, really.
That's a very urgent need, actually, especially when you're talking about tall buildings.
So if the need is urgent, what are the officials doing about it? New Zealand's building standard NZS 1170.5 has warned, where there are severe stiffness contrasts, the designer should be wary of the effects of resonance. Do engineers take that into consideration?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a fundamental part of the design process.
What do engineers do to prevent that happening?
Traditionally, nothing. Our codes do allow for different soil effects, in other words, soft grounds. Those codes do not take into effect the interaction between our buildings and the ground.
And do they consider the resonance of the soil as well?
Absolutely, yeah. There are different soil classes.
Taking into account the period of the building as opposed to the soil will be required, is that true?
That can be done, but it's not done to any great extent in present design practice.
What an engineer designs for, the strength of the building in a severe earthquake, could be undone simply because some other factors come to play that negate it.
That's also very possible. What we don't know is what the 2,500 year earthquake really looks like, and so we don't know what its frequency content will be. It could be a very large earthquake a long way away, which will give us the long period motions and none of the high frequency motions. It could be a big earthquake very close by. We won't see much of the long period motions, we'll see a lot of the high frequency motions.
Some seem to infer or even state that resonance is not really considered by engineers.
Resonance is well understood by earthquake engineers.
The design is a bit of a guesswork as to designing for something we don't know what's going to happen yet, and we've got to take reasonable precautions. We can't take every effect into account.
There's always a particular earthquake with particular characteristics which might attack a particular building in an unfavourable manner.
Since 1996, the heat seems to have come out of the resonance debate. Today, scientists prefer to use the word amplitude. But the fact still remains, if the soil in the building has the same frequency, then the building will be in real trouble.
The big question, of course, is was there any resonance in Christchurch?
Yeah, so there was basically, so you've got a low frequency amplification or resonance, which we assume, we observe this in records from the largest quakes, and we assume that this is related to the basin. There's also, locally, you can get higher frequency amplification at certain locations.
So if you look at Christchurch, there were a few dominant periods that characterized the amplification in Christchurch.
So is it possible that the resonant effect affected some of the buildings in Christchurch?
Certainly the soil amplification would have been one factor that contributed to the type of ground motion that we saw in Christchurch. Of course, it's definitely not the only factor. I mean, we also have to stress the importance of the source.
The site-to-site variability was enormous. So you could sit in one site and feel the earthquake in a particular fashion, and you move 200 meters and the impact would be very different. So the site conditions is very variable in Christchurch, and I'm sure you could sample quite a few resonant frequencies.
Did that happen in Christchurch?
A little bit, yes. If you look at the response spectra, there are certain natural periods which show up in the frequency content of the motion, which are obviously functions of the natural periods of the ground where the recordings were made.
So both seismologists and some engineers agree that resonating soils probably had an effect on buildings in Christchurch. So which buildings were affected the most?
In fact, the tall buildings actually did very, very well in general. It was some of the 5 and 6 story buildings that got us into trouble. The tall buildings, they were some damage, yes, but they were pushed much beyond their design levels, which is roughly 2,250 year event. We had something nearer a 4,000 year event, which is much greater than that. And our codes actually don't preclude collapse at that level of shaking. Our design level earthquake is a 10% likelihood of exceedance in its life of the building. We don't design our buildings to have a Boeing 757 flown into them as well. We take reasonable precautions. We can't be clairvoyant. And we design a building for a 50-year life.
So, designing a building to survive an earthquake isn't easy. But one way engineers can check their sums is to pretend their building has been hit by a known past earthquake. They do this by running a time history analysis.
So if resonance is going to develop, it will be developing in the model itself.
How many designers do time history analysis?
Very few. The reason for that is it's not possible to do the time history analysis until you've actually designed the building.
The more sophisticated analysis would be done for critical structures and for important structures.
So traditionally they were done, if they were done, as a final step to make sure there were no surprises.
Why shouldn't that be legislated so that it has to be done in all cases?
Well, at the moment I would hate to think that most of our design engineers doing time history analysis because they don't know actually what they're doing. And you had better know what your answers are before you start. And then if you don't get those, one of you is wrong and you have to find out which one. In engineering in particular, it's not an exact science, it's a lot of art in engineering.
So even using computers to check if a building will stand up in an earthquake isn't easy, and it doesn't end there. If the building is irregular in any way, the problems multiply.
You can have buildings which are very attractive in terms of functionality and appearance, and quite often those buildings will have very irregular distribution of masses. They would have different spaces, sizes of spaces, different sizes of foundations. Those are going to respond in a very complex way.
And of course, the CTV building was a building of regular design.
It was very irregular, so therefore the building twisted, so that it meant the columns deformed to a much greater degree than was anticipated. The columns had inadequate reinforcing steel, which meant they collapsed in a brittle manner rather than being able to bend and deform but not collapse.
The Royal Commission did recommend the identification and repair of similar design failings in other buildings across New Zealand. It's been 5 years now. How's it going? Have those buildings been identified?
And yes, we identified quite a large number of those that were potentially had non-ductile columns.
Have you a number there?
And no, I haven't really got
10,
the numbers.
20, 100?
Oh no, there was quite a few that were potentially.
What, 50?
No, it was higher than that. But then we worked with the territorial authorities to liaise with building owners to get detailed investigations done of their buildings.
And has that happened?
And that has been happening, and it's not finished yet. As a result, there have been buildings that have been strengthened, that owners have looked at their buildings and decided that they needed to do something about it, and they have strengthened it.
What about the buildings that haven't been strengthened yet? Shouldn't the occupants be aware of this?
Well, it's important again to realise that just because they've got non-ductile columns doesn't mean they're unsafe. There could well be some compensating features that mean a non-ductile column is perfectly safe because it's not going to be exposed to that high level of distortion.
But they could be unsafe. You've identified them as potentially unsafe.
We have identified them as having one risk factor, and
would you be happy for your son or daughter to work in that building?
If people are certainly if building owners are concerned about their building, they can get, and they haven't been contacted, if they can certainly get the information from the territorial authority. And if people who are occupants of those buildings who might be concerned can certainly seek information from their building manager, but they can also get it from the territorial authority. So that information is available.
How do they know it's a dangerous building when you're not telling them it's a dangerous building?
Well, it would be inappropriate to release a list of non-ductile column buildings.
Why?
Because that would potentially cause unnecessary alarm. It is not a list of buildings that are unsafe. It is a list of buildings that has one factor that might be a problem. But in most cases, the compensating features will mean that it's perfectly safe.
So the government has no intention to release that list?
There's still a process going on, working with the territorial authorities and the owners.
Well, that was interesting. Buildings that are both safe and dodgy at the same time. I certainly would like to know if I was working on one. But these aren't the only dangerous buildings needing urgent attention.
And then there's the problem of old buildings. Old buildings where the front of the building can collapse into the street and kill people, as happened here in Christchurch. This street has been rebuilt, so we assume it's safe. But what about all the other old buildings in Wellington and Auckland and all around the country? What's going to happen to those in an earthquake?
They have a term for dodgy buildings. They call them earthquake prone. And there's a minimum code level which they will eventually need to meet.
Is 33% enough? Well, it's not something, that's the legislative minimum. We would always encourage owners to, wherever feasible, to strengthen to higher than that. And certainly the New Zealand Society for Earthquake Engineering recommends 66% as a minimum.
So why not 66%?
Well, again, there's a cost and trying to balance costs and risk.
But buildings like here in Cuba Street, Wellington, are only required to meet a third of the current building code.
But retrofitting buildings doesn't have to be expensive or difficult. Some radically simple ideas are out there. One comes from Canterbury University with a rather hip name, plug and play.
So the plug and play are going to be connected like a shock absorber. The concept is nothing else than the same concept of a fuse. The fuse is going to guarantee that the energy absorption is going to happen over here. They're called plug and play because basically you plug it in, play, or you can take it off. And during the earthquake, it's going to sway. Instead of breaking at each single connection between the elements, they're just able to rock. And the whole structure will be swaying, not as much as, because of the energy absorbed by the fuses. I don't need to have an earthquake engineer to actually change my fuse. I will just go to the seismic shop and I'm going to go back home before the aftershock to simply, by myself, change the plug and play.
A fiendishly simple idea. But what about those buildings we walk past every day?
At the moment, the people in the street don't know which buildings are safe and which ones aren't. Some of these buildings have been retrofitted and some of them haven't. Would you like to stand in the street during a major earthquake?
However, there's another building that could well have passed the 33% barrier.
The PGC building, it was close to the standard and it fell down. So is that good enough?
Yeah, well, the PGC building was a building that was built and designed in the early 1960s, which you'd have to say was in the infancy of seismic design.
But a lot of older buildings didn't fall down.
That's correct. That one had some particular vulnerabilities, and obviously it was very high levels of shaking, and the earthquake always finds out the most severe weaknesses in the building.
Do you think the soil might have been affected there?
I think in our investigation there was no particular issue with the soil that was raised.
Very close to a river. In fact, the Avon
It was,
River.
yes, it was. But it was actually to do with some, the shear walls were relatively lightly reinforced.
And yet older buildings would have had less adequate shear walls, wouldn't they?
Well, you know, all buildings vary.
Is it just me, or is there an institutional resistance to considering the effect of soils? However, it's not all bad.
Geotechnical surveys, that would be expensive.
Okay, well, that's we've undertaken it as a very successful collaborative process that we are now managing. It was under CERA, and that is the Canterbury Geotech database, which has enabled all the investigations to actually be in the public. Well, be available to geotechnical engineers.
And this is commercially sensitive material. They're not going to let it go.
If they are going to use the database, they have to contribute to it.
Right.
So it works extremely well. It's really one of the success stories from Canterbury.
That's great that the geotechnical engineers are getting their act together. Now all you have to do is get the scientists on board as well. Speaking of which, one followed up the Christchurch quakes with a special recording of aftershocks on the CTV building site. I wonder what they showed.
Well, the question was, what was the shaking at that CTV site during the major earthquakes? And because we don't have an instrument there, the answer is we don't know. Based on a lot of recorded aftershocks at the CTV location, we can assume that the recorded shaking elsewhere in the Christchurch Central Business District was equivalent to that recorded at the CTV site.
But for the big quake, the other sites recorded definite peaks and dangerous soil amplification. What about these?
The rest home did show a 1 second peak, did it not?
Correct.
And the CCC one, 1.3 seconds?
Well, again, it depends on, in one event, yes they did, but did they systematically show that event after event? No. When we saw a 0.7 second peak at CTV, we also saw 0.7 second peaks at those other stations for those small earthquakes.
But if you saw them at the other stations, wouldn't it sort of indicate that that site behaves similar to those other stations?
It does, exactly. That's the conclusion, that the CTV site is the same as the other sites.
But you can't have your cake and eat it too. If the aftershock peaks are similar, then surely the main quake peaks could be similar as well.
If the building has the same resonant frequency,
yeah.
So if there is a certain peak that happens to be the same peak as the building that sits on it,
yes.
Is a problem?
Well, yeah, it can be, yeah.
Okay.
If that shaking is large enough to cause damage. Yeah.
And no comment about CTV building in that case?
No, because again, we didn't have a recording at the location during these events, and all of the aftershock analysis we have shows us that that site didn't behave in any peculiar way.
And yet the recordings of nearby stations show definite peaks.
Well, they all show peaks. That's the nature of a response spectra. It shows peaks at some period.
It seems to me that what actually happened on the site is still an open question, a question that should lead to further academic study. However, my research has revealed there's a real problem here too, as graduate engineers leave university with just a rudimentary understanding of how soft soils can affect buildings, never alone knowing how to model them as well.
But they do require skill in modelling, etc. And most undergraduate courses anywhere in the world do not cover that sort of skill.
It probably needs to be more formalised than it is now.
There is a move in parts of the world to make a master's degree the requirement for design of multi-storey buildings, but it hasn't happened anywhere yet.
It can't just be left up to academics too, because university lecturers now do not have industry experience.
And it doesn't end there. On-the-job training and project competence are big issues too.
Now, the public should expect that the profession can self-regulate it to make sure that people are not stepping outside their level of competence.
The number of competent people who could provide that mentoring, in most instances they are just simply too busy to do it.
What about categorisation? You know, code E soils maybe, or maybe there's a group of engineers who can deal with that but others can't? I mean,
no, I don't think it's as simple as that. A competent engineer should be able to deal with any type of soil.
But if a building is designed with something that's quite different to usual practice, you're saying that a normal engineer still should be able to do that?
Well, they should know whether they're competent to do that or not.
In the commission, a phrase was used several times. The phrase was, you don't know what you don't know.
It would be very unusual for a New Zealand educated and engineer who has experience to be in that situation of not knowing what to do or where to call for help.
And yet in the past it's been found wanting.
Most professions have some of this.
However, there's a way to keep an eye on things, and that's to now and then look over a shoulder.
I believe most of my colleagues would endorse the concept of there being some auditing that might be done at the building consent stage. It would have to be done by other engineers as well.
And then there's the problem of silos. In filming this doco, I was horrified as to how little some professions knew about fundamental research and findings of sister professions. So you're quite happy with the interrelation of geotechnical engineers with design engineers?
I think it's going in the right direction. We are not yet at the level that you would like to be.
That was a recommendation of the Royal Commission for the geotechnical engineers and structural engineers to work closer together.
The geotechnical engineers and structural engineers should sit down together, talk. But that talk has been going on for about, 30 years.
It's structural engineers, geotechnical engineers, architects, all those sorts of pieces coming together.
And at the base of all of this is the issue of cost. How do you design in all of those safeguards if nobody wants to pay for them?
The collapse of fees and timescales on doing jobs has put enormous pressure on.
I guess in everything it always comes back to control in terms of cost, and that may have been the cost in terms of what can be done in terms of investigation.
Because most buildings are built to the cheapest possible price.
To achieve the right balance between complexity on one hand and cost.
For example, this building spent the money and built to 180% of the code, but then struggled to find tenants who would pay the increased rent. And 180%? What does that say about our current code? And finally, a parting shot at the engineering status quo.
Prior to the earthquakes, particularly reinforced concrete buildings, research was showing concerns with a lot of those forms of construction. A lot of those concerns were validated in the earthquakes, and what rebuild of the CBD that is going on is dominated by the braced steel buildings. One would expect significantly improved seismic performance.
This journey has taken me some way. From a scientist's comment about the effects of soft soils, through the minefield of major earthquakes yet to come, to speculation as to how they will affect old buildings and tall new buildings in New Zealand's central business districts.
One learning is we can expect large earthquakes anywhere. Don't always look at your major faults when there can be other faults that are sort of unknown.
The key issues are what have you actually underneath your building to start with, what properties does it have.
And those design procedures are going to explain how to include soil structure interaction effects more appropriately.
But also trying to then predict what those effects will be if we get some major ground shaking.
As long as we leave the existing building stock in the way it is, if we have other large earthquakes, we can expect to see similar levels of damage.
And regarding the not enough time for residents to build criticism, I've since confirmed that onset is not time dependent. And what about soil amplification? Did it cause buildings to resonate in Christchurch? Did that amplification cause resonance?
Yes. That amplification might be due to resonance.
Do you think that might have happened in Christchurch?
It might have happened in Christchurch.
Got to ask this question. Do you think it might have happened with the CTV building?
I don't know.
And of course, no one knows. But the question still remains. Was there more at play here than simply poor design? There are many more questions begging answers. But until the research is done, only one conclusion can be drawn, and that is, we don't know what we don't know.